Time now to talk about some pretty significant developments this week in the world of politics. We've got our good friends Bob Babbage and Grayson with us for this segment of Inside Kentucky Politics. Good to see you all.
Good to see you.
On this very rainy day. And so we are recording this earlier than we normally would because we're trying to make sure people can get home safely. Let's start with this ongoing spat between the legislature and the governor's office. And it's about a measure on kinship care, which we'll define for folks, that was passed in the 2024 session, right? Allison Ball has gotten involved, the state auditor. She's suing to say that the Beshear administration has to implement this law on kinship care that in instances of abuse and neglect would allow relatives to take temporary custody and be eligible for foster care payments. So the governor has said in a communication that he provided today to KET, it says from the communications director, while the governor signed and supports this bill that would help our children and families prior to signing the bill into law, he made the General Assembly aware that it would cost millions of state dollars to provide the services. His administration relayed this information to the bill's sponsor, committee chairs, LRC staff, and members of the General Assembly on multiple occasions. Lawmakers had many opportunities to deliver the funding both during the 2024 and 25 legislative sessions, but chose not to. It is simple. The Kentucky Supreme Court has ruled the state cannot implement programs and policies if it doesn't have the funding to do so. It's disappointing the auditor would file a taxpayer-funded lawsuit without even attempting to speak with the administration about the issue first. Grayson, take it from there.
So last year, this bill passed. Nobody's arguing about the underlying merits of this bill. I think it passed unanimously. But in the veto period, the governor said, hey, here's a bunch of bills, including this one, that are unfunded mandates. You didn't put money aside for us to do this. We can't implement them. So that's part of that was notification number one, but it happened after the budget was already finished.
Right.
Legislators didn't like the timing of that. Obviously, they were here in session earlier in the year. They could have fixed that particular bill or some others. They didn't. And then the governor added, here's a few more bills. She did this again. And the legislature's like, you have money. Once we appropriate the money, it's kind of fungible. And where it popped up this week was both the lawsuit, but also in a committee hearing where the administration asked to increase a reimbursement rate to some providers. And Senator Julie Rocky Adams, who sponsored the kinship care bill, said, if you have the money to do this new thing that wasn't budgeted, why don't you have the money to do my new thing? And so there is this fight. It's been going on for a couple of years. And earlier, maybe a month or so ago, in some public settings, post-session, Republican leaders have said, hey, Governor, if you want us to give you specific instructions on how to spend the money, we can do that, and you may not like it.
Right.
And so we're going to continue to see this over the next 6 months until April next year when the session ends and the budget is passed, with some probably pretty specific items.
And we heard that on the House floor. I think it was Pro Tem David Meade who gave a pretty impassioned speech saying, if you want some direction, we're going to give it to you. I mean, it's setting up a pretty fiery start to the 2026 legislative session. That is the budget session. That is 60 days.
Yes, we're going to see this discussion go on and more limitations proposed by the legislature regarding the governor, from very small things to perhaps significant things. This is an unusual step by the state auditor to take an action in court. In my 4 years, we
Did you ever do it?
did not do that, even though I had...
You had a great intern there.
I had an all-star intern, probably one of the best ever to be under the dome.
Yeah.
But it just didn't occur to anybody that kind of issue wasn't raised or pushed our way, and there were other priorities at the time.
So why her do it? Why?
Well, because she can.
Because she can.
She has the standing. It is an issue related to the financial picture of the state. So it's a new step. It's pushing the boundary a bit, but it probably has merit on that basis of her constitutional duty and her legal duty to put forth any position she feels is important or significant. From the governor's perspective, he did make a point, and there might have been a smidgen of time for them to fix it originally, and certainly time more recently in 25. They didn't. Now they're talking, and you were there at that meeting. The President, Stivers, and Speaker Osborne gave the indication that they would zero-base some budgets. That means you're taking a multi-million-dollar cabinet maybe down to zero to say, what's this and what's this and what's this. There is time to do that kind of tedious analysis, but it's a very large commitment by the legislature to look in that direction. And that's somewhat doji, if you
I was going to say,
and
this has not been done before. At least I think it was either Osborne or the Senate President said, we haven't done this, or it's been a long time since we've done it this way.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is kind of the performance auditing
Right.
idea. What are you spending? What are you getting? Is there a better way? It'd be hard to do the entire budgetary analysis in the months we have left, but to take a major area and examine it this way would be significant and might lead to conversations in the interim of 26 about other parts.
Right.
Yeah, or you could do something tiny small like the governor's office itself, which they could totally zero-based budget that. And as Bob described it, basically what you do is you figure out what does everything cost, and you start a budget from zero, which is kind of how we do it. You know, families do it
That's
that
what I
way.
say. That's how you run your household.
But traditionally in state government, what happens is they do a snapshot on a certain day, and however many employees you have that day and their salaries, plus whatever the costs are, that's what you sort of start with, as opposed to starting with zero. You kind of start with what you had, and then there's some other adjustments, and it's just a different way. But ultimately, what this is it is a fight between the governor and the legislature on defining those parameters. I mean, when I was Secretary of State, they didn't pass a budget for a couple of years. And so we operated as if there were still a budget. The Supreme Court was very clear. You got to have a budget to flesh things out that aren't in the Constitution. And here there is this dispute, right? Like how specific does the legislature need to be? And we have two different parties. We have a communication problem, which we talk about all the time between the two parties here, meaning the governor and the Republican leaders. And ultimately, this may just be worked out in the courts but it's pretty clear this next year's budget process is going to be a tough one for the governor.
It also relates to the federal decisions.
Yeah.
We push a budget forward. We talk about a continuation, a continuing resolution, or what have you, with no thought about, well, we could really increase this and get a tremendous result, or we should decrease this because we finished that.
Yeah.
It's a complete abdication of that kind of budgeting that every family does, every church does, every business does, to look where you can do better. If taxpayers really absorb that, they would say, gosh, do your job and get in there and do those things. But even today we're experiencing in the news budgetary stalemate in Washington because it's hard to agree with the debt looming and more debt accumulating and more debt maybe in our future and all the other factors and things we need to do.
Yeah. Well, Jason Petrie probably was the game changer in some of the direction on assembling these budget processes. Yeah,
a few years ago, the House Republicans, after they took, the Republicans, won in 2016, the control of both chambers. And so starting with, I think it was the 2020 budget, Petrie said, why am I introducing the governor's budget as the starting point? Why am I introducing it? I'm the Republican.
And he's the House Appropriations
Revenue Chair. And so under kind of the cover of darkness, the House went ahead and prepared its own budget, submitted it right before the kind of the beginning of the session, the COVID session. And over the last couple of years, we've really seen that our budgeting process looks more like D.C., where President Trump a couple weeks ago has said, here's my budget. And even Republicans said, thank you, that's nice.
Right, yeah.
And so that's kind of how we've been the last few years of governor can introduce a budget. It's a political document. It's not irrelevant because it does go out there. But it's not the opening bid.
That's right.
And it's a big change. When folks would go to Frankfurt and say, when KET says we need more money or we need this capital investment, you would always start with the governor to get it into the governor's budget. And that's not how it works anymore. Now you start with the House to get it in the House's budget.
In Frankfurt and Washington, you've got an executive budget, but you've also got a House and Senate.
Yeah.
They don't always agree on
that's right.
big things and little things.
Yeah. Okay, well, that took all of our time, but it was good enough because we needed to stay there, hang our hat there for a little bit. It was very educational. Thank you, guys. Good to see you.
Thanks. Good to see you.
Stay dry and safe.